From the moment Sheduer Sanders walked off the field that night, the stadium energy didn't just follow him, it clung to him. Cleveland had just witnessed a rookie quarterback with the body language of a 10-year vet dismantle a defense without breaking stride. But this story wasn't going to end at the scoreboard. No, the real twist came minutes later, in the narrow tunnel beneath the stadium stands, where one of the loudest critics in town was waiting to file his post-game opinion. For weeks, Tony Grossi had been circling Sanders like a hawk over an empty field. Project quarterback. If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed. Product of the name. Not ready for NFL speed. It was the same tune since OTAs, repeated on radio shows and columns, and offhand sideline comments picked up by microphones. Sanders had heard it, every word. So when Sanders rounded the corner toward a locker room, sweaty, still in half his uniform, adrenaline humming under his skin, and saw Grossi standing there with a recorder, the air shifted. There wasn't a blow-up. There wasn't yelling. Instead, Sanders slowed his walk, locked eyes with him, and said in a measured tone that still cut to the post-game chatter, "Why is it always negative?" The question hit harder than a shove. No smirk, no sarcasm, just a direct call-out, steady as a spiral. "I've done everything you've asked, right? Moved the chains, no turnovers led the team. Still, it's never enough for you. Why?" His voice wasn't raised, but the echo in the tunnel made it sound bigger. A couple of players stopped in their tracks. You could see the reporters nearby shift uncomfortably, unsure if they should keep filming or pretend they weren't listening. Grossi mumbled something about fair evaluation and just doing his job, but Sanders didn't flinch. Fair? Fair would be judging what I actually do, not what you decided I'd be months ago. He didn't linger for a back and forth. He said his piece, nodded, and walked into the locker room. It wasn't a scene, it was a statement. And here's the thing. You could almost feel the weight lift off the locker room when he said it. His teammates had heard the chatter too, had watched the constant skepticism in the press. To see their rookie quarterback stand his ground without theatrics, without a meltdown, showed them something that stats can't. Poise under pressure isn't just about the pocket. It's about every arena you step into. That composure was the same thing Sanders had brought to the field all night. On paper, his numbers weren't mind-blowing: 138 yards, 2 touchdowns, 10 completions on 15 attempts. But in context, they were surgical. Every throw had a purpose. Every read came quickly. There wasn't a single moment where the game seemed too fast for him. The opening drive said it all. The Panthers tried to test him early, sending an edge blitz on the first third down. He didn't panic. He shifted protection, took the snap, stepped up, and rifled a strike to Cedric Tillman for 17 yards. First down. Momentum. By the second quarter, he was running the offense like it was his huddle from day one. No frantic scanning, no hesitating in the pocket. Just clean footwork, decisive throws, and an understanding of where his playmakers would be. His first touchdown was a perfect example. Play-action fake to freeze the linebackers, eyes locked down the middle to hold the safety, and then a quick release to Njoku in the seam for 6. Textbook execution. What really stood out, though, was how he operated in bad field position. Twice, the Browns were pinned inside their own 10-yard line. Twice, Sanders navigated out without a single risky throw. He used a run game when the box lightened, took underneath routes when the linebackers dropped deep, and flipped the field without the Panthers ever getting a whiff of momentum. By halftime, even the skeptical pockets of the fan base were buzzing. The Browns went into the tunnel with a 2-score lead, and Sanders' body language said everything. Calm, head up, helmet tucked under his arm like he'd been here before. The second half gave him one more chance to silence anyone still clinging to their system QB talking points. Midway through the third, with the Browns facing 2nd and 12, Sanders read a disguise cover 2 and dropped a perfect touch pass over the corner and under the safety to Amari Cooper. It was one of those throws you can't defend. You either have the arm and timing for it, or you don't. Sanders did. And yet, the post-game conversation could have easily been dominated by his stats or his highlights. Instead, what people talked about What social media clipped, what teammates posted about, was that moment in the tunnel with Grossi. Not because it was confrontational in the usual athlete versus reporter way, but because it was measured, earned, and rooted in truth. Sanders hadn't ducked the criticism. He had addressed it head on after delivering exactly the kind of performance that made the criticism look flimsy in the first place. In the locker room afterward, players were grinning. QB1 just handled business on and off the field, one lineman said, shaking his head. Myles Garrett laughed and called it the quietest mic drop I've ever seen. Even Stefanski, who usually avoids any whiff of controversy, acknowledged that Sanders had the right to expect fair coverage when his play had been this consistent. By Monday, the storyline in Cleveland had flipped. The Project QB label was gone. Analysts were replaying his throws alongside that tunnel clip, framing it as a night Sanders took control of his own narrative. Fans flooded call-in shows, saying he should start week 1 of the regular season. For Sanders, though, the win wasn't about changing headlines. It was about the work. Tuesday morning, he was back at the facility before sunrise, reviewing film, not his completions, but the plays he didn't like. The overthrow on the sideline, the timing that felt a half-beat slow on a third-down checkdown. I can't give them anything to be right about, he told his quarterback's coach. That's the part that separates him. He's not just chasing highlight reels or viral moments. He's building credibility brick by brick. That night in the tunnel wasn't a burst of ego. It was a culmination of weeks of quiet preparation, of doing the work while the noise swirled around him. The next practice after the Panthers game was faster, sharper, more focused. Receivers were running crisper routes. The offensive line was more vocal in pre-snap communication. It wasn't a coincidence. When your quarterback shows he's willing to fight for the team's respect, both in pads and in conversation, it changes how everyone around him responds. By the end of the week, Cleveland wasn't just asking when Sanders might start. They were asking how far he could take them when he did. The preseason was supposed to be a slow ramp-up for him, a safe way to get reps without too much pressure. Instead, it had turned into a showcase, not just of arm talent and decision-making, but of leadership that demanded to be taken seriously. And if the critics had been loud in July, they were a lot quieter now. After all, there's only so much you can say about a Project QB who's out there building something real, one throw and one conversation at a time. By the time the Browns gathered for their midweek practice, the tunnel moment had already taken on a life of its own. What had happened between Sheduer Sanders and Tony Grossi was only a handful of sentences, no shouting, no theatrics. But inside the building, it was being retold with the kind of reverence usually reserved for game-winning drives. Players described it like a perfectly thrown pass, precise, deliberate, and impossible to defend. The offensive line room was buzzing about it during film study. He didn't even raise his voice. One lineman said, almost impressed, just called him out, kept walking. That's leadership. These were guys who'd been in the league long enough to know the difference between a quarterback trying to look tough for cameras and one who was simply stating facts. Sanders' confrontation wasn't about optics. It was about setting a standard. If you're going to judge him fairly, and more importantly, judge him based on what he's actually done. Stefanski didn't address it publicly, but the next morning in the quarterback meeting, he made a point of telling Sanders, you don't have to go looking for respect. You earn it every day. But there's nothing wrong with demanding honesty. The rest of that meeting wasn't about drama, though they dove right into film on the upcoming preseason opponent, a team with a defense that loved to bait young QBs into mistakes. This was where Sanders' meticulous approach shined. He wasn't just watching plays, he was dissecting them, noticing when a linebacker leaned just a little too far toward the line before dropping into coverage, picking up on how the safeties disguise their rotations. He made notes for each scenario, cross-referencing them with the Browns' playbook, so he'd know exactly where to go with the ball when he saw those looks on game day. On the practice field, the impact was immediate. In 11-on-11 drills, he was calling out defensive alignments before the snap, shifting protections, and hitting receivers exactly where the coverage was weakest. The veteran receivers, Cooper especially, started smiling in the huddle when they heard certain calls. They knew Sanders had spotted something and was about to exploit it. It wasn't perfect, One drill ended with him forcing a throw into tight coverage and nearly getting picked. The defense celebrated like they'd won the Super Bowl, chirping at him on the way back to the line. Sanders just nodded, tapped his helmet, and on the very next rep, read the same coverage, pump-faked the defender into biting, and hit Tillman for a 30-yard gain. Garrett, watching from the sideline, turned to a teammate and said, "See, he's already learning from his mistakes in real time." That adaptability carried into the joint practice later in the week. Joint practices are a different beast. Tempers flare, the energy spikes, and you're facing defenders who don't care about protecting the quarterback in drills. The opposing defense came at Sanders hard, sending blitz after blitz, mixing stunts and disguises to throw him off rhythm. Instead of shrinking, he leaned into it. One rep stood out. The pocket collapsed fast, a linebacker coming clean up the middle. Most rookies would have either taken the sack or bailed out to the sideline. Sanders stepped up, absorbed the hit, and delivered a bullet to Njoku in stride. The play went for 20 yards, but the message was worth more. Pressure doesn't rattle him. It sharpens him. By the end of that practice, the Browns' sideline was loose. Players were laughing, offense and defense trading competitive jabs, and Sanders was at the center of it. That was the other thing. His confidence didn't come at the expense of the locker room dynamic. Even with all the media attention, he wasn't isolating himself. He was talking with linemen about protections, chatting with DBs about coverage reads, and even joking with rookies about rookie duties. When game day rolled around, the atmosphere in Cleveland felt heavier than a normal preseason tilt. Part of it was the opponent, tough defense, playoff aspirations, but most of it was the growing realization that Sanders was auditioning not just for a role, but for the future. Every snap was going to be scrutinized not only by fans, but by coaches deciding how soon they could hand him the keys. The first quarter was a defensive grind. Sanders had to deal with 2 false starts and a holding penalty on the first drive, but instead of forcing the ball, he chipped away with short completions. On one play, facing 3rd and 8, he read a late safety blitz and hit forward on a swing pass that went for first down. Not a highlight reel moment, but exactly the kind of smart decision that keeps drives alive. In the second quarter, he started opening up. A deep sideline throw to Cooper that threaded between the corner and safety drew ooze from the crowd. On the very next drive, he caught the defense in a bad matchup, linebacker on Njoku, and lofted a perfect pass down the seam for a touchdown. That was vintage Sanders, reading the mismatch pre-snap, trusting his arm, and delivering without hesitation. But maybe his best moment came in the third quarter. Backed up inside his own 5 after a great punt, the defense stacked the box to force a quick mistake. Sanders calmly audibled, sending Cooper on a quick slant. The throw was on time, the catch was clean, and the play went for 15 yards, flipping field position and momentum in one move. The sideline erupted, not because it was flashy, but because it was a sign of maturity far beyond his years. By the time his night ended, his stat line was efficient again. Completions in the mid-teens, over 150 yards, a touchdown, no turnovers. But the numbers still didn't tell the whole story. What he was building went beyond a box score. Trust, credibility, and the sense that when he was in the huddle, the offense had control. Post-game, reporters asked about the tunnel moment from a week before. Sanders didn't dwell on it. "It's over," he said simply. "We got work to do." It was clear he wasn't chasing drama. If anything, he wanted the conversation to go back to football. But among fans and teammates, that confrontation had already become part of his lore. In the locker room, the mood was equal parts excitement and focus. Nobody was handing him the regular season starting job yet, but you could feel the shift. Stefanski talked about competing every day and stacking good decisions, but his eyes gave away what he was thinking. This kid was ready sooner than anyone expected. Over the next few days, the whisper started, not from the media, but from inside the building. Equipment staff talking about prepping QB1 gear for him just in case. Receivers talking about how different the timing felt in practice now. Even some of the defensive coaches quietly admitting that Sanders gave their unit the toughest looks in scrimmages. By the end of the week, the only people still doubting him were the ones who hadn't been paying attention. The rest of Cleveland? They were just waiting for the moment the coaching staff made it official. And Sanders? He was still in the film room at 6 a.m., breaking down the next offense on the schedule, proving that whatever he'd said in that tunnel was more than just a clapback. It was a promise. The morning after that third preseason game, the practice facility felt like a quiet storm was brewing. Not the tense, uncomfortable quiet that comes with loss, but the kind of quiet that happens when everyone in the building is trying not to get too far ahead of themselves. Players nodded to each other in the hallways. Trainers moved quickly between treatment rooms, and the cafeteria chatter was low. Even in the quarterback room, the usual light joking was toned down. It was a calm before a decision. Sheduer Sanders arrived before most, headphones in, backpack slung over one shoulder. He headed straight to the film room, bypassing the coffee station. Inside, quarterbacks coach Drew Petzing was already queuing up clips of the next opponent's defensive packages. Sanders slid into a chair, notebook open, pen ready. If there was a big announcement coming soon about the starting job, he didn't act like it. To him, the work came first. The tape session wasn't just about plays. It was about patterns. Petzing asked him what he noticed about their nickel corner in press coverage. Sanders pointed out how the guy opened his hips too early when shading inside, leaving him vulnerable to quick outs. That kind of detail impressed coaches because it showed Sanders wasn't just memorizing plays. He was diagnosing tendencies like a veteran. Later that morning, Stefanski held a closed-door meeting with his offensive staff. They went through every metric, every drive chart from the preseason, comparing Sanders to Gabriel and the rest of the QB room. Statistically, Sanders wasn't blowing anyone away. His numbers were efficient but not monstrous. But when they added context, third down conversions, red zone efficiency, turnover avoidance, the rookie was in a league of his own. Then there was an intangible factor, the way the offense looked under his command. The drives were cleaner, the tempo sharper, the sideline calmer. By noon, the whispers around the building were getting louder. A few veterans were asking their position coaches if they'd heard anything. Some players tried to read body language during the walkthrough. Who got the first team reps? Who was taking extra snaps with the starters? Sanders, as usual, stayed locked in. He didn't look around. Didn't count reps. He just ran the plays. During team drills, the defense tested him with aggressive looks. Double A-gap blitzes, delayed corner rushes, post-snap coverage shifts. On one play, the defense showed cover 2 before rotating to cover 3 at the snap. Sanders caught it instantly, adjusted his throw mid-drop, and found more on a deep curl before the safety could recover. The offensive sideline let out a cheer. That's the thing. These weren't rookie reps anymore. This was a quarterback running an offense, and everyone on the field could feel it. Even Gabriel, who'd been professional and supportive through the whole competition, gave Sanders a nod after a particularly sharp 2-minute drill. In the locker room afterward, the energy started to shift from curiosity to inevitability. Guys were talking about how Sanders was making the offense easier for everyone else. Linemen didn't have to hold their blocks as long. Receivers were getting the ball in stride. Running backs had cleaner running lanes because defenses were respecting the pass. The front office noticed too. Andrew Berry, the Brown GM, had been watching from the sideline during practice, hands in his pockets, expression neutral. But as players filed past him to the showers, he stopped Sanders for a quick word. Nobody heard what was said, but Sanders cracked a small smile afterward. The next day was the lightest practice of the week, mostly walk-throughs and situational work. Sanders ran with the first team for the majority of the session, but the staff kept rotations going to avoid tipping their hand too soon. After practice, Stefanski gathered the team near midfield. His tone was steady, but there was an underlying weight to his words. We talk about stacking days. We talk about earning trust. Some guys in this room have been doing that since camp started. Some of you have been doing it your whole careers. And some of you are doing it for the first time right now. The work shows, the tape shows, and the decision will show soon. That was as close as he'd come to acknowledging the quarterback decision publicly. But in that moment, everyone already knew what was coming. In the days that followed, the buzz moved outside the building. Fans were dissecting every throw from Sanders preseason on social media. Analysts on local radio were openly lobbying for him to start. Even some national voices were calling Cleveland's QB situation a no-brainer. But Sanders didn't change. He still sat in the front row during meetings, still took extra time after practice to work with his receivers, still graded himself critically. When a reporter asked about the speculation, he gave the same answer he'd been giving for weeks. My job is to be ready when my number's called. Whether that's week 1 or week 10, the preparation doesn't change. Inside the facility, the respect he'd earned was now solidified. The linemen were already discussing how his cadence kept defenses guessing. Cooper was talking about how Sanders' ball placement allowed him to make plays after catch. And Njoku was telling younger players to watch how he prepared. Then came the final preseason game. For many teams, it's a formality, a chance to evaluate depth players while the starters rest. But Stefanski gave Sanders the first 2 series. It was a quiet signal. You don't put your future QB on the field just to get him reps unless you're getting him ready for something bigger. Those 2 series were vintage Sanders. The first was a slow, methodical march down the field, mixing short passes with a couple runs, capped by a touchdown on a perfectly timed slant to Cooper. The second was a test of composure, starting inside his own 20, facing a 3rd and long after a sack. He hit more on a crossing route, dropped a 25-yard shot to Njoku on the sideline, and set up a field goal. No fireworks, no panic, just production. When he came off the field, Stefanski met it with a handshake and a quiet word. Sanders nodded, helmet under his arm, and stood by the bench watching the rest of the game like a coach. The next morning, the announcement came. Sheduer Sanders would be the Browns' starting quarterback for Week 1. The locker room erupted when Stefanski broke the news in a team meeting. Garrett stood up and clapped. Cooper grinned and slapped Sanders on the back. Even Gabriel came over with a handshake and a quick, go handle business. For Sanders, it wasn't the finish line. It was the next starting point. That afternoon, while the media was still buzzing about the decision, he was already in the film room, studying the Week 1 opponent's defense. He knew the criticism wouldn't disappear. He knew every mistake would now be magnified. But he also knew this was exactly what he'd been working for. The rookie who'd been labeled a project, a product of his last name, had just earned the job the hard way, by being consistent, composed, and ready for every test thrown at him. And Cleveland? For the first time in years, they had a quarterback who looked like he could carry more than just a team. He could carry a city's belief.